Hey guys, how are you doing? Well, let's talk really quickly, and I think this video is going to be super duper valuable for you. Basically, the question that I want to answer is the indie game dream still possible? And you know, we've talked about this before, but I reached out to 7 legendary game devs to get their thoughts, and it was so cool because every single one of them responded. And guys, I think at the end of this video, it's gonna be a long video, but I think at the end of this video, you're gonna be really, really encouraged. I know I was, because I mean, the game industry feels, I don't know, it just feels kind of spooky right now. Like, it's not as easy as it used to be to like make tons of money selling a viral game. And it almost feels apocalyptic. And there's one person in here who thinks it is apocalyptic, whereas I think there's 6 other developers who are actually very, very encouraged, and they actually think that indies, specifically indie developers, are actually going to dodge a bullet, whereas publishers and AAA are not going to dodge the bullet. So let's start with publishers, okay? Well, actually, before we do that, I actually want to give you some credibility here, because a lot of you might be wondering, oh my goodness, is it another indie game developer on YouTube giving advice? Just so you're aware, I do have some credibility because I released a game called Neversong, right? This is the PlayStation physical copy, which is just so cool. I love this thing. And we'll talk about who did this in just a sec, because it's one of my publishers. And there's another one. We did a multi-release of Pinstripe and Neversong in Korea. And then we also did a Nintendo Switch for my other game, Pinstripe. But those are my games, right? And then I've also got a game called, let's see here, Twisted Tower, which is currently in development. It's my first 3D game, and is being released by 3D Realms. Okay, so let's start with my one of my publishers, Serenity Forge, and this is Zhenghua Yang, and he goes by Z, and this is just 4 of his many games in his company's portfolio. You'll notice that these games all have a very like artsy, emotional, story-driven feel. And he actually talks about that in his quote that he gave me about the indie apocalypse, or at least the seemingly indie apocalypse. So he says, the indie game industry is currently facing several challenges, including an oversaturated market with too many games competing for attention. A tendency for developers is to chase after hype-driven and hit-driven trends, a lack of strong branding focus. And what's really cool about what he's saying here is that there's other developers, and we'll read their quotes in a sec, that mention brand. Now, what is brand? Okay, what is brand? Well, brand is building an audience. That's what brand is. You're building a strong image, not for yourself, but for an audience. Why is that important? Because you're building an audience that can sustain your studio for a decade, right? So he's really talking about building an audience here, right? So branding focus is really important. So he feels like game developers are lacking a strong branding focus and a heavy reliance on a limited number of platforms for distribution. So like Steam, for example, just Steam. This is important here. As he says, game companies often spend way too much resources chasing virality with new products in unsustainable ways. The way I read that is they're just not building a brand. Right, they're not relying on their own their current IPs. They're not relying on redistributing their own IPs on multiple platforms, and they're also not worried about building a sustainable audience. Rather, they're trying to constantly reach new audiences with new viral products. Okay, let's continue here. Now, this is going to sound a little bit of a kind of like PR here, like a PR statement, but I can promise you that what he's saying here is not PR, and I'll explain in just a second. Serenity Forge, on the other hand, has always taken a different approach by maintaining a focused brand dedicated to creating meaningful, emotionally impactful games. This approach makes our games narrative-driven and timeless, allowing them to be more resistant to market volatility and continue to sell well over time. Why? Because they're building a brand, aka they're building an audience. And an audience, guys, for me, an audience is as simple as we just have 80,000 people on an email list who have bought our games, and they love our games, and we can continue to hit that same audience. 80% of your revenue, this is my opinion, but I've also heard this from other digital marketers as well. 80% of your revenue is going to come from repeat customers. Okay? I don't know if that's true in the game world specifically, but I know it's true in just digital entrepreneurship in general, okay? Hitting the same audience over and over again with a product or a new IP is way smarter than trying to get a new audience every time you have a new game, okay? And I did want to mention why this is not a PR statement. When he says they maintain a focused brand dedicated to creating meaningful, emotionally impactful games, when Z says that, he's dead serious. And I know this because I pitched, he licensed Neversong. Again, here's Neversong. He licensed Neversong, his studio did, or his publishing studio did. They licensed it, and they also licensed, I believe, the Switch version of Pinstripe. They licensed it, but when I pitched my next game, Twisted Tower, to them, because it didn't hit their brand, it's a violent shooter, because it didn't hit their brand, he rejected it. Even though he's already signed 2 of my games, he knows I follow through, he knows my games make money, because we did recoup. Yet, he rejected Twisted Tower. And that's because it did not hit his brand. So for publishers out there, publishing indie games, and we'll talk about developers in a second, for publishers out there, it's so important to stick to building your audience. You're not going to build an audience if you release random games, okay? All right, let's keep going here. We're going to hear from Gavin. So Gavin is on the other side of the spectrum. Gavin is a developer, a solo indie developer who does not work with publishers, and in fact, in his quote here, talks about not really liking the idea of working with publishers, especially in this current climate. But he made Choo Choo Charles, and Choo Choo Charles just did obviously amazing. It was totally a solo game, and it was also self-funded. Now, if you guys are interested in learning more about, funding opportunities outside of being, self-funded, so working with publishers or, getting kickstarted, there's a totally free webinar or like a lecture series below that I've done. It's really cool because I'm going to teach you how to make 6 figures with just a demo. This isn't fake. This is real. This is how I fund my studio. This is how I've done this, like, I think 3 different times. You take a demo and then you raise money and you earn 6 figures from publishers, Kickstarter, etc. So click the link below if you want to learn how to do that. It's free. It's super easy to watch. Yeah, okay. But let's hear from Gavin. So Gavin has a different opinion about the indie apocalypse, or just the state of the industry right now being kind of difficult. He says, it seems like the game industry is only in a difficult place right now for AAA and publishers. And I actually kind of agree with this. They've been trying to, and we'll talk about that in a second, why I agree with that. They've been trying to expand with larger scale games and larger scale budgets to keep up with the increasingly high demands of consumers. But they haven't been able to keep up with the quality execution of these concepts, or they've been distracted making games that are simply too derivative and lack the flair needed to sustain themselves. AKA, they just don't really have a hook, right? They're derivative games that, like, for example, Gavin's making a prison escape game, okay? Well, sure, it's a derivative, but he's created a flair for that game. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's really, really unique and it has a ton of flavor visually. And it's called Cuff Bust, by the way. I was thinking, what's the name? It's called Cuff Bust. He continues, I don't see any significant evidence that the industry is in a tough spot for indies. This is like not solo indies, but like self-publishing indies who don't, work with a publisher. They seem to be doing as well as ever, and with all the negative backlash towards most AAA releases recently, it feels like the aura around indie games is more positive than ever, to a point where AA and even some studios that should arguably be labeled as AAA are trying to rebrand themselves as indie underdogs to regain favor with the public. Man, he's really good at writing, isn't he? That was a great quote. Good job, Gavin. Okay, he says mid-size, and by the way, this guy is, I think he's 23 or 22, so he's very, very smart. And I say that in a jealous way. I'm very jealous, actually, because I'm like 34 and I'm learning from Gavin. But anyway, he says mid-size indies that are looking for publishers might have some trouble, since a lot of publishers are cutting back on the funding of new projects. This is an area that I don't keep up much with. While my opinions on publishers are nuanced, I'm generally against working with them in an indie context, so I'm not incredibly informed. But ultimately, there aren't enough good games in development that publishers can get their hands on. He continues, I think the sentiment towards publishers in the indie space has changed a bit, and more people are willing to self-publish. There's more benchmarks and information online now regarding what wishlist counts to aim for. By the way, like 10 to 20,000 wishlists. And because of things like Steam Next Fest, there are way more games with way more wishlists than ever were previously. Just a few years ago, it took about 100,000 wishlists to reach the top 100 most wishlisted games. Man, I can't talk. Now you need over 300,000 to get to that same position. Now, I know I just said 10,000 to 20,000, but Gavin said 100,000 to 300,000. Gavin is, well, he's at the top of the indie game developers in terms of his goals and his revenue benchmarks. For me and for you guys, we're aiming for, can we just make 50,000 bucks, please? You know, can we make $100,000? That would be great. That's why I say 10 to 20,000 wish lists. Getting on the top 100 most wish listed games, that to me is not the best use of your time or your emotional energy. But for Gavin, it is, because that's the caliber of developer he is. Okay, indies are doing better on their own, and it seems like more of the largest, most promising titles are being self-published, which has publishers with lower tier games that aren't sustaining them anymore. This is so important right here. The modern indie publishing system has been fundamentally flawed from a business perspective for the last decade-ish. So it only makes sense that it'd fall apart at some point. What's crazy about what Gavin is saying here, and by the way, I work with publishers, okay? I will likely continue to work with publishers, at least to a degree, right? I don't know if I'll go all in with every game, but I do work with publishers. I'm working with one right now. Gavin is hitting something that is true, okay? I've heard from one of my previous publishers, and it's not my current one, but I've heard from a previous publisher that what he's saying is true. There was a fundamental flaw in the business perspective of publishers. Publishers have been throwing around way too much money at indies. And instead, honestly, the scope needs to shrink significantly for indie games to be profitable. Otherwise, they're going to spend $1 million on an IP for an indie game, and the game is going to make 500 grand. What does that mean? It means you lost 500 grand, right? And I think that's happening to a lot of publishers. Okay, so he's dead on here. All right, he wraps up. I don't really have hard data on which to base all of these claims, other than the higher wishlist counts for more games, but this is the pattern I've been noticing. And his gut is correct, and I've heard this from other publishers as well. Like I was saying, Gavin's gut is correct here. Guys, this does not mean that publishers suck, and this does not mean that publishers are evil, and this does not mean that publishers are gone. It means that things are changing. That's about it. You know, publishers need to change the way they're doing things. And I'm talking to all of my publishers right now, and there is a sense that I'm getting from all of my publishers that things need to change, and that, well, the bloat needs to be cut from the development process and from the budgets and the schedules. We just need to be more conservatively minded when it comes to the bloat that indie game projects have. Small teams, small budgets, short development schedules. Okay, let's move on here. Who else we got? Oh, Gavin's not done here. He just keeps talking, doesn't he? No, I'm kidding. So to stay afloat, I think solo devs and anyone that's not trying to put a bunch of money behind their projects can basically do the same things that other devs are doing. Trying to make money to support development through external means like YouTube, freelancing, selling assets, plugins, courses, or a day job, and putting that into their projects. It's so funny because there's just like not even 1% of the comments I get on social media are, Thomas, he does YouTube. He's a YouTuber. He's not a game dev. And for some reason, people like to try and slam. If someone does one thing to make some money, then the other thing is invalid, right? My games have brought in more than a full-time income for me and my studio. My current game, Twisted Tower, the funding that we got for that game not only funds my salary, but also my team's salary, okay? Yet I still do YouTube. Why? Because I run a business on YouTube, okay? So not only am I building an audience for my games on YouTube, it's kind of like a small reason I do YouTube, on top of just because I love it, but it's also a business. It's an educational platform on YouTube, right? So I teach how to market games and how to sell games. So it's a business, right? And so you guys shouldn't be afraid of what Gavin is saying here, which is, look, it's totally fine to learn to make money on YouTube, to freelance, to sell assets. Now, the goal here is not to use that only to fund your games, but what it is it's a safety net and it's a backup plan. Now, fortunately for me, I've never had to only rely on YouTube, if not rely on it at all. I mean, honestly, my games are always funded by publishers. It's just YouTube is just, I guess, gravy, right? But I love having a backup plan. And so that's what I'm saying here, and I think that's what Gavin is saying. Support your development. If you can, support your development through other means. AKA, he's just saying be an entrepreneur here and have a variety of drips of income. And that's totally fine, and you shouldn't feel bad about that. Okay, let's keep going here. He's still going. For people trying to find publishers and fund mid-sized games, I think it's best to just scale back and self-publish lower budget games. I tend to agree with him. Although, with Twisted Tower, for us, it's a bigger game, right? It feels AA sometimes, so it's a bigger quality game. That said, I'm looking forward to going to sort of smaller games in the future. But ultimately here, he's just saying we need to scale down. As indies scale down and focus on these smaller, tiny core ideas with a very interesting hook, and just focus on that, and don't bloat the game, which indie developers are so tempted to do because they want to make gangbusters, $1 million, $2 million in revenue. That's not the way we need to be thinking about that. In fact, my buddy, it's Tomas, but I call him Thomas. I shouldn't, because his name is Tomas. His quote is coming up here, and he talks a lot about, look, just focus on making smaller games and don't worry so much about a ton of revenue. Just worry about making enough revenue to get by. Okay, let's keep going here. If people don't want to scale back and still want publishers, then they'll just have to buckle in for this is so true. They'll have to buckle in for a difficult pitching process and eat the punches. What's he saying there? He's saying that in order to get, $1 million for a bigger game, indie studios need to be okay with a lot of rejection, because publishers right now, I think they're tightening the purse strings, okay? Doesn't mean, guys, it doesn't mean you can't find a publisher who wants to give you 50 grand or 100 grand or 200 grand. Those still exist, okay? They're still out there. They're still giving money, okay? But if you want to get a bigger project, $1 million plus, it's going to be tough, okay? And you're gonna have to be okay, like Gavin's saying, you're going to have to be okay with eating the punches. All right, I got this really interesting quote from an anonymous publisher. Now, this is not my current publisher, okay? I just want you to know that. It's just a buddy of mine who does have a publishing studio, but he did not want to be named in this video. But this is kind of bleak. But remember, this is not from an indie developer. This is from a publisher. And do you remember what do you remember what Gavin said? He said it's the publishers and the AAA industry that's going to get hit with the bullet being the indie apocalypse, not indie game developers, okay? And this kind of rings true to that. This is, again, a publisher, anonymous publisher, and this publisher says, we used to do forecasting on wish lists, but recently they've gotten 3 times more expensive to acquire. And by the way, that's publisher speak. I don't think about acquiring wish lists with money. The way I think about it is I'm going to acquire wish lists by just creating great social media content. So that's interesting to me, that the publisher mindset is, how much does it cost to acquire wish lists? And I get it. They're going to try and use their money effectively. The way you watching this video, the way we think about it is probably, what kind of social media content can I create, and how can I be clever with it to get wish lists, right? Anyway, they've said that it's 3 times more expensive to acquire and have a conversion rate is what they meant, of half of what they used to. I think it was like 18% was supposed to be the conversion rate for wish lists, and now it's down to like 10 or even lower. It makes marketing games cost prohibitive for a lot of indie publishers. That means, what does that mean? It means that indie publishers are going to be a lot more afraid to throw around $1 million on a new IP. The market has changed. The COVID bubble has burst. What's the COVID bubble? The COVID bubble is a ton of money came into the economy from... Isn't that weird how that happened? But a ton of money came into the economy, whether it was like bailouts or like government checks. It just flooded into the economy, and everyone had a ton of money and they spent it. Believe me, I received a good chunk of revenue for my digital products during COVID. It was wild. COVID was a very profitable time of the year, or a season for the digital economy. But what this publisher is saying here is, right now is essentially the Black Friday of the games industry, not the Black Friday after Thanksgiving. He's talking about the Black Friday for the Great Depression. So that's bleak. I hope things turn around soon, because a lot of talented people are about to find a new industry to pursue. Yeah, that's tough to hear, but yeah, find a new industry to pursue, and the games market may never get back to the talent it once had. I'm hopeful that this is only true for the big dogs. So publishers and the AAA studios. I don't think this is true for indies, okay? And there's a reason why I think that, because all the indies I'm talking to, and there's a ton of quotes coming up here, the indies I'm talking to do not feel this way. It's the publishers who feel this way. Let's keep going. Next person on our list is Edmond McMillan, and if you saw my previous video, you'll know what Edmond has to say here. But Edmond made Binding of Isaac, and he also made Super Meat Boy. Very, very talented developer. And Ed has a very interesting perspective here. Ed's perspective comes from the early days of indie game development, where when you launched a game and it was a good game, not like gangbusters, but it was just good, you made $1 million, right? It was just explosive amounts of revenue for viral games or just good games, okay? But even Ed here, he says, I feel like the response is universal at this point. And the response is a response to my question, is the indie game industry difficult right now? Is it apocalyptic? He said it's universal. His response is universal. Too many indie games release daily. It's still very flooded. The only solution we have is to make better games. Design always wins. You can make a very simple design that shines very bright gameplay-wise. So what does he mean here? Like, how can we apply this to ourselves as we make indie games? I think ultimately what he's saying is have a very, very strong hook, specifically a gameplay hook, something that is very, very unique, and take that strong hook and simply focus on it like crazy. And Ed does this so well with his games. With Binding of Isaac, with Super Meat Boy, with his new game, Mugenics, there's a strong focus on a very unique hook. And for him, obviously you have the visual hook. Ed's games have a very unique visual style, and he's very focused on brand building. Again, we're going to talk about brand in a second. But he's also very, very focused on the gameplay hook. That's super duper important to Ed. And it seems so simple, right? It's like, just focus on a hook. No big deal, right? Just focus on a mechanical hook. What's the big deal here? Why can't every indie developer do that? Well, that's easier said than done, okay? Focusing on a very unique gameplay hook, the reason it's so difficult is because we've got 18,000 games launching in 2024, or maybe that was 2023. Tons of games, and all of those games want to have that unique hook. Okay, so you've got everyone, it's like Where's Waldo, right? Everyone's trying to be unique, okay? When everybody's unique, nobody's unique, okay? So it's very, very difficult to create a unique gameplay hook. And guys, I'm guilty of this. Gameplay hooks, unique gameplay hooks, that's not my thing. Unique visual styles, those are my hooks. And by the way, this is from Pete Cooper. He was a Blizzard artist, but he took my style for the screenshots of the game and he turned it into cover art. And so I have a very unique art style that I believe really stands out, okay? But when it comes to my mechanics, they're pretty straightforward. And Ed's saying here, Thomas, dude, he's talking to all of us. You got to have a strong gameplay hook, okay? And it needs to be very, very unique to stand out, okay? Jason Smith, creator of Cultic. We've heard from Jason in previous videos. I want to reiterate what Jason is saying here, okay, and what he said in the previous video. In response to the indie game industry being apocalyptic, I love Jason because he's so pointed and so direct. Jason says, it's been pretty crowded in the indie game market for a long time. But in my opinion, it's getting even worse now that you've gotten it's a very unique perspective. He says, you've got incredibly talented folks from the AA and AAA scene who are tired of the state of the industry and are splintering off to make their own game studios. Notice what he said here. He said small studios. Okay. Small, what does he mean? Small studios meaning tiny teams, low budgets, and they're competing with who? You and me. Tiny little teams of hyper talented, AA and AAA veterans. So now you've got industry professionals with more resources also competing with the dev who just quit his full-time job to chase a dream while living off of savings. By the way, that's me, and that's also Jason, okay? Which both Jason and I, things worked out for us. But there's a lot of game developers, and maybe that's you right now watching, and leave a comment if this is you, where you're tempted or you have used your savings to make a game, and maybe it's not going to work out for you, right? And so we're going to be competing with AA and AAA veterans. So that's a really interesting perspective from Jason. My favorite quote that I received from these 7 indie veterans was from Tomas Salah. I think I'm saying it. It's got to be Tomas, right? Whatever it is, Tomas or Tomas Salah. He created this game called Falconeer, and man, it's so freaking pretty. I mean, look at this thing. It's gorgeous. It's so gorgeous. It's hyper focused, and we'll talk about that. And it's got a hyper strong feel. And you'll notice that all of his games have the same visual style. What is he doing? He's building what? A brand. Now, what is a brand? It's so important. What is a brand? Is a brand you focusing on your studio and your style and it's really cool t-shirts and you wear cool hats? No, that's not why you build a brand. You build a brand for this. That's why we build a brand, okay? A brand is synonymous with a big audience. You're not going to build a big audience if the way the games are presented, are always different, right? Or they're always a different genre, or they're never really fitting a theme that your studio represents. For me, same sort of thing. All of my games have a very strong, moody, like Tim Burton-esque style, okay? Very strong Tim Burton-esque style, okay? And even my game Twisted Tower, same sort of vibe, right? That's because I'm doing what Tomas is doing, and that is building a brand. So here's what Tomas says. Sorry, dude. Basically, I have always struggled to survive in this industry. I did my decade with a studio, and that was always tight. Right now, this very moment, I've never had it this good. Isn't that crazy? And I wouldn't say the Falconeer is insanely viral, okay? It did pretty good, but it's not like, Cult of the Lamb or Binding of Isaac or Minecraft, It's a pretty successful game, but he's saying, I've never had it this good. And he's a solo developer, by the way. So from the cockroach solo dev side of things, we're good. But the pathways for success in this industry are becoming more established and rigid. That means some of the freewheeling, make a great game and strike it rich, those times are gone. And yes, the dependable revenue streams are becoming smaller. Heck, my solo dev game outsold Concord by good margin, which was a Sony first-party games as a service that likely cost tens of millions. But the upside is that with me, thousands of indie devs yearly beat the odds. This is really encouraging. It really is. When he sent me this, I was just really excited. The causes for the downturn seem relatively clear now. Basically, every developer and publisher is now competing for the sparse cash, and it's particularly sparse now just because of not only the economy in the United States, but the economy globally. The sparse cash in gamers' wallets with the combination of giant established, again, games as a service style platforms. That's like Roblox, Fortnite, Overwatch. A growing back catalog of great games that are still as great and often still look great and are on a permanent discount. Tons of fresh indie talent, and that includes you guys, right? That includes me. Solo devs and micro-scale studios outmaneuvering, out-designing, and out-innovating existing studios. So we're all competing with each other, guys, and we're all trying to be clever. That's tough because when everybody's clever and when everybody's unique, nobody's unique, right? And this is, by the way, that's why audience building is so important. We'll talk about audience building in just a second. Algorithmic app stores where the main mode of visibility is discounts and sales, right? Which they call fests, right? A festival is just a discount and a sale. It's the same as, a 50% off sale at a couch store, in the 1980s. It's the same freaking thing. They call it a festival. It's the same thing. It's just a sale, okay? And that's how so many Steam games, including mine, make money. It's during Steam sales, right? All of these trends are depressing the revenue that you can expect with a game. This is 100% happening and affecting publishers and developers who haven't been releasing games at a brisk pace these last few years. This is funny what he's about to say. But all of us who have been releasing games are going, no S, Sherlock. And this has been happening for years now, and it's irreversible, right? But we are just adjusting and dealing with it. So for Tomas, this is normal, right? This is normal. It's no big deal to him. Okay, that's why he's focusing on brand. That's why he's focusing on building games with a small budget, right? Because he's known about this. He's known that 100% of the trends are depressing the revenue, right? He knew that. He knew that this was 100% happening and affecting publishers and developers who haven't been releasing games at a brisk pace these last few years. He knew this, okay? So it's not surprising to him. All right. So his strategy is create a franchise, an IP, a brand. This is where we're getting with this video, okay? And you guys will see the very last slide here. I talk about this and why this is so important that all of you need to focus on building a brand. For him, a brand is something that draws folks in across multiple games, that allows me to reuse assets, code, and work smarter, quicker, and deliver products that connect to an existing audience, my audience. Other devs like yourself, he's talking about me, Mr. Thomas Brush, other devs like yourself are making themselves a brand. So what does that mean? This is the brand. Thomas Brush is the brand. I was actually talking to a subscriber yesterday. His name is Jason. I was talking to him yesterday. We were hanging out, and I said, listen, dude, I'm going to build a game studio not necessarily on my games and the way they look, but literally on my face. And I know a lot of you think that that sounds really lame. It's like, why would you build a brand off of your personality? Here's why. Because my personality is one of my strongest fortes. Now, if you met me in person, you would disagree. But I'm really good at talking to a camera. And I'm really good at doing YouTube videos, okay, and talking sort of off the cuff, right? And so for me, it's my strongest forte. And so I'm going to focus on my strongest forte to build an audience and a brand. And that audience, because they enjoy being with me and watching my content, therefore they will also probably love my games, right? Now, how you want to build your brand and how you want to build your audience is up to you. I would just say lean into your forte. So we're going to call him Mr. Salah here. Mr. Salah, his forte is obviously his beautiful beard and his wonderful grimace, but also it's his art style, okay? That's his big focus, is his art style. So he says, I don't believe in the viral successes we see that go stratospheric. I believe in dependable, good business practices that fit our modern times, aka building a brand. And social media is perfect for that. It's like made for building an audience. At least for now, they seem to work. These business practices, these practices of building a strong brand and a strong IP. I open Steam and I see plenty of failures, but I also see plenty of successes. Perhaps a more modest scale, but a survivable scale for us small timers. What's a small timer? Small budget, small team, small game. Suddenly you're very profitable, right? Whoa, I just burped. When you have a big project at a big scale and a big team, then all of a sudden profitability becomes a lot less likely because you spent all this money trying to make this huge game. So you want to keep it small so that profitability can then be high, right? You might make less money overall in terms of gross revenue, but when it comes to actual profit, your margins are much higher. But you always got to make, I bolded this and made it red because I freaking loved this sentence. But you always got to make the most technically challenging thing or visually challenging. Otherwise, you're dealing with thousands of copycats or competing games. So yes, Mr. Salah here is saying, hey, look, you need to focus on brand. You need to focus on building a strong series of IPs that build an audience over time. But you also need to focus on making the most technically challenging thing or visually challenging. I'm going to try and parse what he's saying here for you guys because when I read it, it immediately clicked, and I'm not sure if it's clicked for you. If everybody is making pretty good art and pretty good music and pretty good gameplay, then you're just basically making a game that everybody else is making, okay? You've got to go in there and say, okay, for example, I can't say I'm going to make blood splatter out of my enemies and it'll spray blood all over the floor. Big deal. Let's figure out how to make it more technically challenging. Let's make it so that when you shoot the head of an enemy, the head pops off and blows into the atmosphere, and it's spinning and blood is spraying everywhere, and every single drop sprays across the walls and decals the walls. Maybe you can go and pick up the head and bounce it like a basketball, right? That's kind of what I think he's saying here, which is not necessarily that mechanic in general, or specifically, but I think what he's saying is you've got to take these mechanics or these visuals to the next level and focus specifically, strongly, tightly on those difficult challenges, solve them, but don't worry about, making everything unique in your game. Just worry about making that one thing unique. That one tiny thing, and go hard with that one thing. And what's interesting about his games, especially the Falconeer, it might feel a little sparse. He's told me this, that some reviews say it feels sparse. It feels like it's not super complex. But that's because he knew that all he needed to focus on was making the most striking visuals he could. And by the way, if you've seen the game, we saw it earlier, you know that that's true. He just said, visuals are everything. That's what I'm going to focus on. Obviously, he made a really great game with great gameplay, but the visuals, as he said here, he tried to make the most challenging visuals and tried to solve that so that he stood out among all the other developers, okay? Chris is our last indie developer on this list. Chris is a really good friend of mine. And he kind of got in a weird situation where Humble Bundle laid off half the staff. No, all the staff recently. And so although he did get published and he got kickstarted, by the way, his Kickstarter campaign did amazing. I think it was over $170,000. So, and we'll talk about Kickstarter in a second. But he had this dream scenario of a publisher and a Kickstarter campaign, just all of it going his way. And then right when they launched their game, their publisher fell apart, right? And so what he said here is, yeah, the industry is definitely difficult right now. We felt it firsthand when our publisher laid off all the staff we've been working with for over 2.5 years. It was a shock, and we're still recovering from the whiplash. Despite everything, our launch was relatively successful, but I can't help thinking about how things might have gone if publishers had managed themselves a bit more conservatively. I think that at some point there was a real oversaturation and mismanagement of money based on projections, and it's always that, right? We're going to make this much money based on 2018. Why? Why would you think that? The industry is completely different now. But based on projections that stemmed from the pandemic. The pandemic was, like I said earlier, it was a huge influx of cash. Everyone was consuming digital goods because they were all stuck at home. And so the projections from the pandemic are no longer relevant. And so that's why, for him, what he's saying here is, it seems like publishers just completely missed the mark when it came to their projections, because those projections were baked and created during the pandemic, which is the last place you want to create a projection. This was our first game, and it was called Bo, by the way. It's incredible. It's a really cool game. So I can't speak of how things have changed over time, but seeing all the layoffs and the crumbling infrastructure for indie games really paints a bleak picture of the old ways of doing things. And I want to encourage Chris here, and I want to encourage you guys. I don't think it's bleak. I don't think it's bleak, because from the indie developers out there who are wildly successful, who've been in it for a long time, it's really not that bad, because, well, if you can build up your wish list numbers to 10,000 or more, if you can learn to keep your scope down and make a small hyper-focused game, you can make over $100,000 in your game, right? Small, tiny games. And my games never went stratospheric, right? These games never went viral. So I don't even know the context. I'm dropping games over here. I don't even know the context. I don't even know the context of a stratospheric game, and then all of a sudden releasing my next game and thinking it'll go stratospheric. And for example, I'm thinking about Jonathan Blow here. Jonathan Blow made Braid, and then he made the Braid HD remaster, and it didn't go stratospheric, and he was confused. The way I see it is like, well, my games have always made less than, I think maybe one of them made more than $1 million, but they've always hit, you know, the hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue mark. They never went super gangbusters. So I'm not shocked and I'm not scared, because it's like, well, I always make games they're just decent games that make decent money, right? And I don't think that's going to change for game developers out there who are just going to make decent money, okay? But for those game developers who are expecting stratospheric numbers, it's different. It is different. But I'm sure that you guys listening don't really care about that. You just want to make enough money to get by, right? So I think more people are playing games than ever before, and over time, new gamers, as they're tired of AAA stuff, they'll discover the awesome things happening in the indie game scene. It's just going to take a while to strike the right balance again. And I'll rephrase that in my own words, which is, it's going to take a while for indie studios to learn how to manage their money better. Or another way of putting it, it's going to take a while for AAA, for publishers to learn how to manage their money better. Because it's like, it's too easy to make games now. With AI and with the tools available for us with Unity and Unreal. And I mean, for God's sake, Godot is competing with Unreal and Unity, and it's open source, right? It's just the tools available are just so good now that it's getting easier to make games. So we need to lower our budgets, because why? Because it's getting easier to make games. And that's okay. We've got to adapt. So if you're an indie dev, Chris continues here, if you're an indie dev right now, I think you should focus on making enough cash flow to survive and making games. Also, crowdfunding seems like it's still a viable option. And this is coming from somebody, Chris, who raised over $170,000 on Kickstarter, I think it was 2 years ago. And I thought, you know, back when I did Kickstarter campaigns, and both of my campaigns basically raised around $100,000, I thought that that was the end of Kickstarter. But crowdfunding is still a thing. Crowdfunding is still a thing. And by the way, crowdfunding is based very strongly on an audience. Again, we're going to end this video talking about the value of an audience. So ultimately, I'm just going to read the last sentence here that's bolded. Basically, do something weird and new that's tangentially related to something people already like. And I totally agree with Chris here. And I call that the big but principle, which is taking something that's known and using the word but and adding a twist. So Metroidvania, but with bugs. Hollow Knight, right? That's the principle there. So what does Mr. Thomas Brush have to say about all this? What's his quote about the how to survive this apocalypse? By the way, after reading these quotes, I don't think we're in an apocalypse. I think indie developers are going to do just fine. What's my quote? Well, it's a couple of steps here. Okay? I really want to make this simple for you guys. And this is the framework I'm going to use. okay? Moving forward with my games, I'm going to be working on games after Twisted Tower. Twisted Tower is my third commercial release. So I'm going to keep making games, obviously. This is my framework. Number 1, build an audience, okay? Build a brand. Focus on a strong, unique brand presence. Your games are a certain theme, a certain style, a certain genre, a certain art style, and build your audience around that. 2, come up with a strong hook. This is what Edmond McMillan was saying. Come up with a very strong, precise, unique gameplay mechanic or a visual style, like Mr. Salah, Tomas Salah with the Falconeer. Come up with that strong visual style or that strong story and focus like crazy on that one hook. And going back to Mr. Salah's quote, okay? Going back to his quote, take that hook as a challenge, okay? Take it as a challenge and say, okay, I've got this hook. It's a game where it's all about eating peanut butter sandwiches. I don't know. Let's say that's a really good hook. It's not, but let's pretend it is. I'm just coming up with something on the fly. Focus so hard on that peanut butter sandwich eating mechanic and treat it as a challenge, a hurdle to get over. How do I make this the greatest hook ever so that nobody competes with this single hook? Or what Mr. Salah did. I'm going to make a toony game where you fly as a bird. It's got like cell shading. How do I make this cell shading and this toony, this toon shaded game so beautiful, so freaking unique that it stands out among all the other games that look like that? And I really do think he did that. That's what I mean by number 2. Focus on that hook. Number 3, develop while staying insanely small. Don't think that because you're making a great game, you have to spend a ton of money. Don't do it, please. Stay small, okay? Number 4, while you're developing your game and you're building that audience, collect 10,000 wish lists. You can do it. You can do it. Post on social media, TikTok, Instagram, X, YouTube. Keep posting content and get those wish lists. I'll talk more about number 4 here and say, and also try and get 10 reviews. For God's sake, get 10 reviews on Steam. Because if you can't get 10 reviews, according to Chris Sikowski, you're going to enter the sandbox. And the sandbox is where most indie game developers are. They're stuck in this sort of, what would you call it? Limbo. But once you get those 10 reviews, something happens with the algorithm where you just plop out of the ground and start to grow. So 10,000 wish lists minimum. That's just the number that I always aim for, and we're over 20,000. I'll say that with Twisted Tower, but yeah, aim for that. Number 5, make a focused 2 to 4 hour experience. That is, if your game is time-based, like it's a linear story game, don't worry about making it 20 hours. You know, for God's sake, you're going to sell a $10 game. So just make it 2 to 4 hours, maybe 5, you're good. Number 6, release your game, right? Now, this is assuming you don't want to work with a publisher or crowdfunding. By the way, I'm totally fine with either of those. I've been published 3 times. I'm totally fine with publishers. But you want to release your game, and then why did I say that? Well, because we're in number 7 here. This is the most important. Do it again, faster. Why am I harping on that? And it sounds like I'm asking you guys to commit treason when it comes to your game's development. What I mean by that is that number 7 feels almost like heresy. Indie game developers are supposed to be, we're supposed to be principled, right? We're supposed to be innocent. We're not supposed to act like corporations, right? But the truth is I want you guys to stay sane. I want you to be happy. I want you to make money. I want you to be free. So that's why I want you to do it faster, because I don't want you to be in development hell. I've been there. I don't want you to spend 3 years on a game. I want you to spend 6 months on a game and release it, be done, make some money, do another one, do another one, do another one. When I say do it again, keyword is again. What does that mean? Continue building your audience. Okay? As you create games, you're building an audience. I'm on my 3rd commercial release. All of my games have a very, very similar vibe. I'm not going to stray from that. My focus is visuals, okay, and story. It's actually atmosphere. That's the main focus, which that's why we're called Atmos games. So that's my brand, right? So, does that make sense, guys? That's a long video. That's almost an hour long. That is my thoughts, and also these beautiful, wonderful 7 legendary developers. That's their thoughts as well. And guys, look, if you want to dig more into this stuff, there's a lecture below. Totally free lecture. I really think it'll help you a lot because it's going to teach you if you want to get funded before you finish your demo. And again, I've done this 3 times. So if you want to get funded before you finish your demo and actually make 6 figures, now there's no promises here, obviously, guys. I'm just telling you what I've done. If you want to make 6 figures before you finish your game, click that link below. Check it out. And I will talk to you guys later. Good luck, guys. I know it's scary out there. I know the indie game industry is kind of scary. I'll be honest, it spooked me as well. But hearing from these guys, it wasn't that super helpful. So leave a comment below thanking all of these developers for encouraging us. This was really, really cool.